Hello, this is Mrs. Pullen for Algebra 2, and in this video I'm going to go over Topical Review 9. So this is on trig graphing, and first let's look at a typical sine curve. Y equals a sine x. So that's just sine of x. That's your basic sine curve. And it's a periodic function, so it has a repeated pattern. And it starts at the midline. In this case, it's the x-axis, goes to the maximum, back to the midline, to the minimum value, and then returns to the midline. So midline, max, midline, min, midline. And that's the normal pattern for sine of x. For cosine of x, the typical unit would start on the maximum value, midline, minimum value, midline, and then returns to the maximum value. So maximum, midline, minimum, midline, maximum. The value in front of the name of the function is its amplitude, and that's the distance from the maximum to the midline or from the minimum point to the midline. So that's the absolute value of that number is the amplitude. The number that's attached to the angle, which is either going to be an x or a theta, it could be other values, but that's normally how we represent it, is our frequency, which is normally represented by a b or an f. And then the vertical shift, which is often represented with a d, is negative. In our case, it's -1, and it's how you shift. And the equation of your midline is y is equal to whatever that value is. In this case, it's y equals -1. If there's a negative in front of the coefficient, that leading term, then it flips the equation over the x-axis. And that's important to know. So let's take a look at example 1. We want to write the equation from the graph. And first of all, is this a sine curve or cosine curve? It's really helpful to identify the midline. Sometimes it's hard to see from the graph, and so we can get it from an equation, max plus minimum over 2. So it's the average of the maximum and minimum value over 2. Think middle or midline. So in our case, the midline would be, so I'm going to represent it D, 5, and that looks like -1 over 2. That's 4 over 2 or 2, and we write it as an equation. And so I'm going to graph it. It's always a horizontal line. The amplitude is the distance from the maximum point to the midline. So in this case, it's 3, or from the minimum point to the midline, which is 3. That's if you're not given an equation and you're getting it from the graph. So a formula that you can use, because sometimes people find it helpful, is max minus min over 2. So in our case, it's 5 minus a -1 over 2, which is 3. And again, it's always positive. The frequency is when you, is if you're not given an equation, which we aren't, and you're doing it from the graph, you would use the formula, we could do it this way, 2 pi over period when you see the end of that cycle. And in this case, we see the end of that cycle occurring at pi. So it's the period at the end of the cycle. So to get the frequency, in our case, that would be 2 pi over pi, or 2. So this is notice how we're starting at the maximum value and not the midline. So it's going to be a cosine curve. We know that the amplitude is 3 in our case. The frequency is 2, and you have to make sure to give it either a theta or an x. Make sure you have an equation, so typically it's y. And then we have a vertical shift, that d, which is the same as the midline, is plus 2. So I just recreated our equation. So let's do the second one together. Sometimes you can see the midline right away, but again, I always think it's helpful. Actually, I should have written the equation here. Okay. So the midline is going to be max minus min, max plus min over 2. So the maximum is 1. The minimum is negative 3 over 2. So that's negative 2 over 2, or negative 1. So the midline's y equals negative 1. Make sure you label your graph. And the amplitude should be 2, but let's just use the formula to double check. So it's 1 minus a minus 3. And that's 4 over 2, which is 2. Since the graph at 0 radians is starting at the midline, it is a sine curve. We see the end of that curve. Notice it's midline max, midline min, midline. So when do you see that full end? At 4 pi. So that's where my period is. Therefore, my frequency is 2 pi over 4 pi, which reduces to 1/2. So we see a half a curve in 2 pi, or a complete one in 4 pi. And so now we write the whole equation. So y equals, remember the y equals, otherwise you will not receive credit. Sine, its frequency is 1/2. Don't forget the angle, either an x or a theta. And then it's minus 1. There's our vertical shift. So let's graph it. So in this case, we're given the equation that they asked to graph. In many cases, they'll tell you what the interval they want to see graphed, in this case, from 0 to 2 pi. Remember, when we graph, we always label the x-axis, otherwise you will not receive credit, and it has to be in radians. So our amplitude is the number that comes in front of the function, and it's always positive. So in this case, it's 3. The vertical shift is either added or subtracted to the function. Sometimes it's in front of the function, not in this case. That leads to the midline of y equals 2. When we graph, we want to find the maximum value. That's a plus d, the amplitude plus the vertical shift, which is 3 plus 2, or 5, and the minimum value, which is the negative of the amplitude plus the vertical shift. So it's negative 3 plus 2, which is negative 1. I'm going to write that down here. And the midline, again, we said was that vertical shift, or 2. And so we have enough spaces to count 1 from each. You should label your y-axis, 3, 4. Here's 5. Here's negative 5. And typically I say every 2 spaces. Sometimes I change that, but typically, well, I don't want to do that yet. I'll explain in a little bit. We'll label the x-axis in a minute. Okay, so this is a sine curve. So the typical pattern is midline, maximum, midline, minimum, midline. If there was a negative in front, the max and the min would switch places because it's flipped over the x-axis. And so in our case, the y values that we're going to graph are going to be 2, 5, 2, -1, 2. And we need to know how far to space those points. And to do that, you want to identify the frequency, which is sometimes labeled as b, which in this case is 2. And then we want to find the period. Well, the period is 2 pi over frequency, or b. So it's 2 pi over 2, which is pi. So we're going to see the end of that first curve at pi, but they want you to graph it from 0 to 2 pi. We also use this spacing formula to tell you how far away each x values are. And so that's always defined as period divided by 4. There are always 4 quadrants, so that's a good way of remembering it. So pi over 4. Okay, so now let's go ahead and label the x-axis. So when you label it, I like spacing things every 2 boxes for the x-axis. Normally everything fits that way, not always, but normally. And you don't have to mark every x, but you have to mark at least once every period. So we're spacing it pi over 4. So it's pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4 is pi. 5 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4, 7 pi over 4, 8 pi over 4 is 2 pi. Let me just check that. So pi over 4, 2 pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, 6 pi over 4, 7 pi over 4, and 8 pi over 4, that reduces to 2 pi. And that will give me my 2 cycles. Next, I'm going to graph my midline, which is y equals 2, and label. And now I'm ready to graph the points. So we're starting on our midline. So it's 2 moving over every 2 boxes because that's pi over 4. So 2, 5, 2. The minimum value is -1. Back to 2. Back to the maximum. Back to 2. Back to the minimum. And back to the midline. And you have to make smooth curves, not pointy. Some of you are making very pointy curves, and you will not get credit for that. And there is our sine curve. And most of the time, they want you to graph 2 cycles. And how did I know that? Sometimes they'll say it. Sometimes they'll say at least 1 cycle, and then you only have to do 1. But here, they said over the domain of 0 to 2 pi, so we have 2 cycles. And I'm going to do one more together. Let's graph number 4. So we see a negative in front that tells me, and that's important to keep in mind, that this is going to flip over the x-axis. We also notice that it's cosine and not sine. So let's pull off the information. The amplitude, remember, is always positive. So it's the absolute value of -20 or 20. Don't forget, there's a negative in front. That's important. The vertical shift is 30, and that means my midline is y equals 30. I can get my maximum value. That's the amplitude plus the vertical shift. So in this case, it's 20 plus 30, or 50. and I can get my minimum value, which is negative of the amplitude plus the vertical shift. That's negative 20 plus 30, or 10. So we see that it's a cosine curve. So cosine's pattern is normally max, mid, min, mid, max. But because it is because there's a negative in front, our min and our max switch. So it's min, mid, max, mid, min. And that's because we're flipping it over the x-axis. So in this case, the minimum is 10, going to 30, going to 50, going to 30, and 10. Our frequency in this case is 6 pi over 5. Therefore, our period is 2 pi over 6 pi over 5. And obviously, you need to simplify that. So you're multiplying 2 pi by times the reciprocal of the denominator, or keep, change, flip. So keep the numerator, change the division to a multiplication, and take the reciprocal of the denominator. When you multiply across, the pi's reduce, and you're left with 10 over 6, which is 5 over 3. So that's your period. That's needed because you need the spacing, and the spacing is the period divided by 4, so it's 5 divided by 12. So you're moving over every 2. So let's label our x and y axes. So I'm going to count every box as 10. So that's 50. And so this is going to be, so this would be negative 1. So this is, because again, and in this case, I only need to graph one cycle. So this is, but sometimes they ask for 2. So I actually want to graph 2 in this case, just so you can get a sense of what this looks like. And I do have that on the solutions for study guide number 2. So this is, we're spacing it 5 over 12. You're really doing 8 boxes. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 over 12, 10 over 12, 15 over 12. Actually, not 8. 5 over 12, 10 over 12, 15 over 12, 20 over 12. And 20 over 12 reduces to 5 over 3. So that's one period. So this would be 25 over 12, 30 over 12, 35 over 12, and 40 over 12 reduces to 10 over 3. So that would give me 2 cycles. Let's graph our vertical shift, which is at 30, or a midline. And let's start graphing the points. So we're starting at the minimum, then going to the midline, then going to the max, going to the midline, going to the minimum value, back to the midline, back to the maximum, back to the midline, and back to the minimum. Let's make a nice smooth curve. And there you have the graph. I hope this was helpful, and I will see you tomorrow.